There is nothing that causes your listener retention to drop faster than a guest who sounds amazing when they pitch you, but does nothing but bore your listeners after you hit record. So if you have ever sat there after an interview and thought to yourself, well, that was terrible, you are not the only one. And there's actually a few reasons why it can happen. So in this episode, we're going to break down how to choose the best guests for your show, how to respectfully say no to those who just aren't a fit by knowing what red flags to look for, how to make every guest sound pro, whether it's their very first interview or their 100th, and how to pull the best content out of your guests so that you can create binge-worthy episodes that your audience can't get anywhere else. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. We had a great question come in from a listener, Cheryl, who asked, how do I know which guests are right for my show? Because everyone sends an awesome pitch. They look great on paper. But then when I get into the interview, some of my guests wind up being duds, for lack of a better way to put it. Cheryl, I feel your pain. And look, this is a safe space. We can call it for what it is. Some guests are duds. And if you have been podcasting for any length of time and you interview guests on your show, or you're planning to interview guests on your show at some point, there is going to be a point in time where you breathe a sigh of relief when you hit stop record with a guest who, despite their best intentions and your best intentions, was just a tough interview. And actually, there are several spots in the guest booking journey where this breakdown can happen. And in some cases, it's the guest's fault. And in other cases, you might be dropping the ball without realizing it. But in all cases, it boils down to some sort of misalignment. So let's take a look at where these breakdowns can happen and why. For a moment, I want you to think about the guest journey. So in most cases, the guest themselves or their booking agency sends you a pitch. You look at it, you say yay or nay. If you say yes, you're going to schedule that guest. There's going to be some prep work that goes into prepping their interview. And usually the guest is meeting you, and in a lot of cases, you're meeting the guest for the first time when you get into the interview room. Now, that guest might have varying levels of podcast and or speaking experience. So you might prep them a little bit, hey, here's how I typically do these conversations. I've got some questions for you, da-da-da-da-da. And then you hit record, and you either hit it off, and you end the interview feeling like it went great, or you don't hit it off and you end the interview feeling like that didn't go so great. So after the fact, if it went great, you're excited to share that interview and you're really hopeful that your guest will too. Or if it didn't go so great, chances are you air the interview out of a sense of obligation to your guest, even if it wasn't great, because that guest gave you their time. Now, there are breakdowns that can happen at every point in this journey, but the biggest breakdown that happens isn't in this journey at all. Believe it or not, the biggest breakdown happens long before that guest pitch is ever sent. And it happens because of a podcast messaging misalignment. And that's because when you take a step back and you think about it, a podcast guest pitch, someone pitching you to be a guest on your show, isn't actually a pitch at all. It's a response to something. Specifically, it's a response to the current messaging and positioning of your podcast. So a general marketing podcast is going to get pitches from literally every SEO guru, social media manager, and quote unquote growth hacker under the sun. But a marketing podcast for moms who have 10 hours a week or less to work on their business, well, now that host is going to be looking for guests who can teach things like automating your client booking process, batching a month of content in one evening after your kids go to bed, or how to run a profitable ad campaign in less than an hour a week. Think about a different category. Let's say parenting, a gentle parenting podcast even. That could still invite every kind of parenting voice. But a parenting podcast specifically for cycle-breaking moms who are raising strong-willed firstborn children while managing demanding careers. Okay, now you're speaking directly to me. And as a host, you're probably looking for guests who can speak to discipline, time management, emotional regulation, psychology, all kinds of things that we as parents can do to not screw up our kids, to be the cause for why they wind up in therapy. Anyway, going on a tangent here, but you get the point. A leadership podcast could literally mean anything from executive coaching to women in leadership or self-leadership or different leadership styles and like so much more. But think about a leadership podcast specifically geared to first-time managers in tech who are building remote teams from scratch. See how specific that is? Suddenly, you're only saying yes to guests who have expertise in building virtual culture, in delegation, in managing teams across time zones. So the reality is the quality of your guest doesn't depend on your guest's level of experience. This is often the misconception. In reality, guest quality is a direct reflection of how clear and differentiated your podcast messaging and your podcast positioning are. So when your podcast focus is crystal clear, well then guess what? It's going to be obvious to potential guests whether they're a fit for your show or not. Will you still get the spray and pray pitches from people who copy paste the same email to 100 podcasts hoping for a yes? Absolutely. But I will tell you what, it's a whole lot easier to say no to the real estate mogul who pitches me now, or the pitch that I got in my inbox literally this morning from someone who did something amazing in the insurance world coming on my podcast with zero podcast experience. Like, cool, dude. I'm amazed for your success, but it's not a fit for my show. And back when my podcast was a general business interest show, it was a lot harder to discern who was a right fit and who wasn't. So that is the magic of clarity. It gives you a built-in filter. And once you have that, then you can create clear guest criteria for saying yes or no to any pitches that cross your inbox. And you can train your team to do this too. So here's what our criteria looks like. First and foremost, we've got to have topic alignment. However, we go deeper than that. We also have to have topic specificity. So they have to pitch a topic that is dead on for you, my listener, for the reason why you listen to this show. I'm not here to babysit my guests or to suggest topics for them. They need to show us that they've done their homework on this show and pitch us with a specific topic or topics that fill a content gap, meaning that their contribution doesn't repeat or just reiterate stuff that we've already talked about on the show, but that it actually adds value to you because in some way it complements my own expertise and gives you a richer experience than what you'd get if you just listened to me talking about podcast psychology and neuropodcasting 99.9% of the time. The second thing that we're looking for is podcast experience. I don't care what accomplishments that you have achieved in your particular line of work. If you have no podcasting experience, you are not going to be a fit for this show. So in all cases, the expert guests that we bring on either have a top 1% podcast or they've had at least 3 or more years of experience as a podcaster themselves who have gone through the learning curve and can speak to that sweet spot between their own area of expertise, be it LinkedIn or email marketing or ads or whatever it might be, and specifically how that relates to podcasting. Everything else, press features, a big following, a long list of credentials behind their name. I don't care. That's icing on the cake. If they don't hit these criteria, my team knows to respectfully decline without hesitation. So if you have ever struggled to decide which guests are a good fit and you're getting pitches from people who look great on paper and you're wondering to yourself, yes, maybe they're a fit, but I don't really know, the first place to look is your messaging. Now, once you've got that in place and you're getting the right guests, but you're still not getting great interviews out of them, the next place you want to look is in the guest pitch itself. Because the second biggest reason where an interview can go off the rails long before you ever hit record is because the topic that was pitched is not specific enough. So for example, you might be getting the right guests pitching you, but the topics that they are pitching, yeah, sure, they might be somewhat related to your podcast, but they're still vague. So don't confuse quote unquote good on paper with good for your audience, because a really great bio with a lot of accolades does not equal a great episode. Your audience doesn't care about someone's list of accomplishments unless it solves their problem or gives them something fresh and new, a new perspective that they can't get anywhere else. We had this happen recently where we actually had a guest pitch us who had all the podcast experience in the world. Like everything as far as criteria goes, check the box, check the box, check the box. But they didn't pitch us a specific enough topic. And this is where you as the host, you can't be afraid to push back. You are the gatekeeper of your audience's attention. And I knew that if I said yes to this guest at face value just because they had the experience without getting more concrete on what the heck are we actually going to be talking about inside of these episodes, that it would result in a surface level interview that you would smile and nod and say, oh, that was nice, but it wasn't Courtney's best interview, no matter how much time I spent prepping for that guest. So it's not just about having the right guest. That's step one. Step two is how clear is that guest on what they're going to be bringing to the conversation. That's because guest prep, which is the next step in the guest journey that we're going to talk about next, starts before you open ChatGPT and say, hey, here's my guest bio, help me prepare some questions. And it starts with deciding on a hyper-specific topic for that episode. So this guest had pitched us something pretty general on scaling a podcast. But scaling a podcast could mean 100 different things. Are we talking about doing it through paid ads, organic discovery, SEO? Are we talking about common mistakes people make when trying to scale? I don't know. You need to tell me. As the expert, if you are pitching my podcast, you should have already done your research to say, here's what I can bring to the table that you haven't talked about yet. So without a clear angle, you as the host are going to be setting yourself up for a surface level conversation, no matter how many hours you spend preparing your questions for that interview. So what we did was we emailed this person back, and in so many words, we said, we would love to bring you on if you can pitch us a specific topic. Can you walk me through a couple of concrete examples or frameworks that you would use to bring this idea to life for our listeners so that this episode is worth their time? Because at the end of the day, my number one job as a podcast host is to protect your time. That drives loyalty, because if you know that every time you listen to this show that you are going to get value out of the 20 minutes that you spend listening to an episode, you'll come back for another one. And the same is true for your show. I would love to bring this guest on, but ultimately there are two different roles here. Your role as the host is to position your show and do that hard work of positioning your show so that listeners can look at it and potential guests can look at it and know whether it's a fit for them or not. And the guest's role is to spend a few minutes doing their research beyond just, hey, I think I'll be a great fit for your podcast. Let's talk generally about whatever, and figure out how their expertise can best fit into your show and pitch you that specific topic. But just in case that they don't do that, here's how you can look at the topic that a potential guest pitches you and know whether it's specific enough or not. So I want you to think of specificity here like levels. Your topic that you cover in an episode, this goes for all of your episodes, not just your interviews, but especially your interviews when a guest is pitching you, your topic needs to be 3 levels deep. So of course, the prerequisite here being you have to have a specific enough podcast, specific messaging, specific positioning to attract the right type of guest. And then of course, using my podcast here as an example, our expert guests need to have podcast experience. But even then, that's not enough for me to automatically say yes. And it shouldn't be enough for you either. Because if they pitch you a broad topic, which is level 1, just like this example I just gave you, scaling a podcast, that's a level 1 topic. What are we actually talking about here? Cool, scaling a podcast sounds great on paper, but what are we actually talking about? So we need to niche it down. Okay, scaling a podcast through organic strategies. That's better. But we need to go even narrower, because there are all kinds of organic strategies we can talk about. And in 20 minutes, I'm not going to have time to talk about all of the organic strategies that you could use to scale a podcast. So what one organic strategy are we digging into? Now, if that guest had pitched me, hey, I want to come on and talk about how these 3 organic strategies based on the data that we're seeing is driving the fastest podcast growth right now, then I'd be like, cool, let's talk about it. What are those 3 strategies? Because I know that I can get through all 3 of those in a 20-minute episode that delivers insane value to you. Or if they came and said, why video podcasting actually isn't the fastest path to organic growth. Or here's the LinkedIn strategy that I'd love to teach your audience that is working right now for getting your podcast in front of the right listeners in less than 20 minutes a day. Okay, now we're cooking. See how that level 3 angle gives the conversation a clear anchor point? That's where the good interviews live. So if your guest pitch is still stuck at level 1 or 2, you have to push back. You have to help them get to level 3, or your episode will lack a clear direction, and ultimately that interview will not be as valuable as it can be. So once you have that topic, then guess what else? Your prep work gets a whole lot easier and your guest shows up a lot more prepared. They're ready to talk about that topic. And that leads us to the next possible place that the quote unquote boring guest breakdown can happen, is in the actual prep work. So here's a really common myth, and I hear this all the time. A good podcast guest is a good speaker. I don't need to do a whole lot of prep if I've got a good guest. And this is not true. Even brilliant guests can be boring. In fact, they can be the most boring sometimes because they're so smart and because they talk in a language like I don't understand. So if you ask the same surface level questions that they have answered 100 different times, then guess what? You're going to get the same surface level interview that they've given 100 different times. So yes, it's their job to pitch you a specific topic, but now as the host, the ball is in your court to do your research and to prep questions that they haven't already answered anywhere else. This is what turns just a regular old interview into something that listeners want to binge. And even deeper than that, this is actually the foundation that sets your show apart and the content on your show from the other hosts who aren't taking the time to do this. Because let me tell you right now, 9 out of 10 podcast hosts are taking the guest bio and they're plugging it into ChatGPT and they're saying, hey, prep me some questions for this guest. And they might modify those questions a little bit, but that is it. They are not going any deeper in terms of the research of the background of the guest, or have they answered these questions on other podcasts? Because guess where ChatGPT is pulling that information from? Stuff that they've already talked about, which exists on the internet. So you have to go deeper. What I do is I actually listen to other episodes on other podcasts that guest has been a guest on. If they have never been a guest on an episode, then congratulations, you're going to get fresh content. But you do have to know how to guide your guest through that conversation. So I'm going to link to a past episode in the show notes where I walk you through exactly what I do in order to prep interviews for my guests. And no, you do not have to spend days of researching your guests, but you do have to go deeper than the surface level. Hey, GPT, give me some questions to ask. Now, on the flip side, I have had people tell me, well, Courtney, this is easy for you. You have a podcast about podcasting. So your guests are naturally going to be good at this. My guests aren't good because they've never had experience as a podcast guest. And I hear you. But guess what? Your prep work itself is the same, regardless of whether your guest is experienced or not. because the work that goes into actually developing questions to ask your guests doesn't depend on their level of experience. The quality of answers that you get from your guest depends on the quality of questions you ask them. So again, I'm linking some resources below for you that I have personally used and studied to help me get better at interviewing guests that I 1000% recommend you check out if you want to get better and master the skill of giving a great interview that your listener cannot get anywhere else to set your show apart. Now, there are a few things that you can do ahead of the interview, regardless of how seasoned your guest is, to help them feel comfortable, because especially if they're less experienced, then guess what? Their nerves are going to be a little bit higher. And even if they are experienced, chances are they've never been on your show before, so they don't know how you do things. So a little bit of logistical prep work can go a long way. If you know your guest is less experienced, it can also go a long way to send those questions ahead of time. Now, don't say this is exactly what I'm going to ask you. Say, here are some examples of a few questions I might ask you in the interview. There is no need to script your answers, but I want you to feel prepared coming into our conversation. Your guest is going to appreciate that, and it's going to help ease their nerves so that they can show up more confident because they have more of a sense of what you're going to be asking in the interview. And I actually have a friend of mine, Kelly Mosier. She's been here on the show, and she's got some great tips for prepping the room right before you hit record. And simply reassuring your guests, look, you're going to be great. I know this, but if you stumble, which I probably will in this conversation, we can edit it out. Okay, so don't be afraid if you need to start a sentence over or whatever. We're going to record for about X amount of time. I will keep an eye on the time so that you don't have to. When I feel like you've given a satisfactory answer, I'm just going to give you a smile and a thumbs up. That way you know to wrap that up so we can move on to the next question and keep the conversation moving. Now, again, if your guest is seasoned, you don't have to do as much hand-holding with logistics, but you do have to craft sharper, unexpected questions to get them off autopilot from the stuff they've talked about 50 times over on every other podcast, so that your conversation feels new, it feels fresh, it feels unique, it feels exciting. And a lot of times what I like to do for my guests is I will actually text them ahead of time and say, hey, since this is the topic we're focusing your interview on, which you should both be clear on at this point, I would love to touch on this and this. Anything to add? Question mark. Anything I missed? Question mark. And just invite dialogue, because if they are a subject matter expert, they're going to be able to give you insights that maybe you didn't think about, leading to a richer conversation. I had this happen one time where I had literally prepared. I spent hours preparing for this guest interview. And then my guest said, you know what? I have really been wanting to talk about this lately. I haven't talked about it anywhere else. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I am just like really fired up to talk about it. And I was like, guess what? That's what we're going to talk about. Because if you haven't talked about it anywhere else, and of course it was a specific topic, then I was like, I want you to talk about it first here on my show. And it has been one of our most popular interviews to date and one of my favorite to record. It was really, really great. So from there, they answer back. You just have a moment to build rapport with them and like share how excited you are for the interview. You want to make them feel good about coming on your show. So ultimately, what makes a guest quote unquote deliver is number one, how aligned their expertise is to your topic, your messaging, and your positioning that your show is all about. Number two, how specific the topic of the episode itself is, and how specifically their expertise adds to the conversation and fills the content gap on your show, doesn't repeat old information. Number three, how much research you've done ahead of time. How deep did you go in your guest prep to expand on stuff that they haven't talked about on other shows, so that y'all can co-create an episode that sets your podcast apart because your listener hasn't heard that content yet. And number four, how well you utilize the time you have with your guests. And this is really important so that you can make every minute with them count. Because at the end of the day, your listener does not care if your episodes are 20 minutes or if they're 60 minutes. If you can hold their attention for 60 minutes, more power to you. But your job as the host isn't to fill some arbitrary amount of time. Just because my episodes have always been 30 minutes, then therefore I have to talk with this guest for 30 minutes. No, it's to make sure that every single minute of what you're talking about with that guest matters to your listeners. And then at the end of the day, now that you've got clarity on all of these things, if a guest pitch comes in and it just doesn't fit the bill, you know what red flags to spot. And it's okay to say no. Professional hosts say it all the time. I say yes. In fact, if you look at my profile on podmatch.com, you will see that I probably have a very low guest acceptance rate. I don't even know what the percentage is right now, but it's very low. And that's intentional because I am a very strong gatekeeper of your time and attention, because I care that much. I care that when you listen, you're going to get something out of it. So when you say no, of course, do it kindly, keep it short, keep it sweet, keep it upbeat. Thanks so much for reaching out. We are currently laser focused on guests who XYZ meet your criteria. And while your expertise isn't currently a fit, we really appreciate you considering our show. That's it. And move on. Because again, picking guests isn't just about filling airtime. It's about protecting your audience's time and their trust in you. So be selective. Push back when a pitch is too vague. Get better at preparing for your conversations and delivering a great guest experience. It brings me no greater joy than when I have some podcast expert come up to me who's been on my show and we're at a conference or something and they're like, you know what, by the way, your podcast was one of the best and most fun interviews I've done ever. I think ever. So that's a huge compliment. And you can walk away from every interview feeling like that was a hit, not a miss. However, there is one caveat to this. Great guests and guest prep will only take you so far if you don't truly understand your audience. Most podcasters think they know their listeners. They know who they are. They know kind of generally how old they are, and they hope that that person's going to be interested in the topic that they're talking about on their podcast. But often they're just testing content with warm audiences who will tell you it's great no matter what. Or they're relying on download numbers to figure out, do people like this show? And we all know that those download numbers don't tell the full story. So in the next episode, we are digging into how to uncover what your audience actually thinks about your show, the mistakes that podcast hosts tend to make when they rely on feedback from friends or colleagues or superfans, and the simplest ways to find out if your podcast is truly resonating with the listeners that you want to attract in the way that you ultimately want your show to resonate. That is all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.